Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening in. I'm Dimitra Janakoulias, and I'm a state coordinator for Braver Angels Oregon. If you're new to Braver Angels, we're a grassroots nonprofit organization dedicated to restoring civic health and reducing partisan conflict. Today, I'm speaking with Rachel Weinstein, former Chief Operating Officer and Field Director with Braver Angels. She's also a language aficionado who speaks, I quote, imperfect but enthusiastic French, Hebrew, Swahili, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. Rachel, it is so great to have you here.
Thanks, Demetra.
One of the things that I appreciate about you is that you're a deep thinker without being too intellectual. Instead, I think you have an unusual amount of empathy and respect for people who see the world differently from you. So let's talk about how you got to this place where you care to understand others and you also want to bring the country back together. So we'll start with a basic question. Share a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? And what were some early influences that shaped you as a person?
I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, and some of the early influences that shaped me. So, first of all, I come from a very politically active family, very left-leaning, progressive, activist family. So I grew up, door to door, not, talking to people about candidate type things and going to Democratic Party headquarters on election night and all kinds of things. And so this is a multi-generational passion in my family. So I come from Hartford, which is also a very left-leaning city and a very poor city compared to the suburbs next to it. And I grew up with a lot of pride in coming from Hartford. And so I think that also shaped my experience of what issues are important to me. I'll also add that, parents of my friends were also very politically active in like labor union organizing, things like that. So that's sort of the environment I grew up in.
So your background was very blue, a very blue progressive family who cared a lot and still cares, I'm sure, a lot about labor and poverty and economic and social issues and making sure people get their fair share. Middle class family with big hearts.
Very active, very activist. Yeah, even my grandmother on my mother's side was like a full-time political activist.
So initially then, what got you interested in polarization?
Well, I think, it really was something that started to bring up strong feelings in me in after the 2016 election. And also sort of I really started to notice that the thing that was the signpost, if you will, that started to really grab my attention is a lot of the yard signs, the In Our America Love Wins yard signs, which I know are really intended to share message of caring and support and safety for people. But I also noticed when I read them that I could see how folks coming from the other side, there's essentially a very strong, actually like attack sentiment in it. And I felt this sort of irony between the signs that were saying, we're the people of love, and the vibe behind them directed at people who weren't, that essentially you're terrible, we hate you. And I think a lot of blues don't notice that about those signs, or can't really have a very hard time understanding how anybody could see it that way. But in my experience, a lot of folks on the right feel that way about those signs.
And how did you learn about that sentiment on the right?
Well, I asked people, I mean, at some point I thought, this is how I'm seeing it land, but I need to validate, is this just me seeing it this way? So I did. I asked this, even through Braver Angels, I asked some of our red members how they felt about it, and it confirmed. I mean, not everybody feels the same way, but it confirmed that others saw that contempt or that attack sort of coming through.
So after 2016, the election, you noticed this proliferation of the signs, the yard signs, welcoming all. And then you started asking people who identified as more conservative how they received those signs and they didn't receive those signs in a warm or welcoming way. And then would you say that started to open your eyes to something you hadn't seen before?
No, I think it was more that what I felt that the signs were saying. I think what I felt is that the signs were saying, you're a terrible person, and they were ironically saying that under the banner of love. So to me, it was sort of a form of hate, but calling it love. And I felt this, I just felt very disturbed because I felt like that the effect of that, there's sort of like a cyclical nature to, when you pour something hateful towards another group, then they respond in kind, and there's sort of this loop that happens. And so it felt to me like it was like accelerating the descent of our country, essentially. And that was, I think, what made me feel so upset was just really uh, feeling how anti-productive it seemed to me, those signs, and having difficulty articulating that to my blue friends that this wasn't helping. In fact, it was even part of the problem. So when I first heard of Braver Angels and watched a video about it, it struck a chord for me with the idea that we don't have to denigrate each other, that we can that we can find a way to love and care for each other without necessarily, wherever you are in the political spectrum. And for me, I think that resonated a lot in the spirit of nonviolence. And so, which was something I already had an interest in. So those things really drew me in to Braver Angels, as well as I think a curiosity about, I didn't know anybody on the right, and a curiosity about who they were and what was going on and things like that.
Had you been curious before about people on the right prior to these events?
I don't recall focusing on that in particular. Uh, yeah, no, I don't recall particularly being curious about that.
It
But
was a newfound curiosity
it was,
inspired by what was going on.
but,
Okay.
mhm, yeah.
Um, and so then you got involved in Braver Angels. You became a volunteer. Ultimately, you began working for Braver Angels and you became the COO. You know, Braver Angels and other quote unquote bridge building organizations tend to be blue organizations. They tend to be dominated by more liberal leaning people.
Mhm.
And so why do you think that that is the case? What is behind that?
So it's kind of the million dollar question, and I have a lot of different thoughts, and I think there's many more reasons than the ones that go through my mind, but I'll share some of the ones that I have thought about. And it's funny, even just what I was just describing to you in terms of, that my interest in nonviolence or, watching the video about Braver Angels and the idea that people could love each other. I want to name without completely understanding the why of this, that those terms are at some level, they're already very blue associated. So like something about the hippiedom and love, unity, peace,
Peace.
harmony. We are all one. Like like it's all culturally very blue.
Sure.
And although I'm not super red plugged in, it's like I think red tends to like protect and serve is more amplified on the right. And so it's interesting to think about why that is, that those are, I think different groups always have different values that are celebrated. Like there's all kinds of virtues out there. You could put 100 of them in a list. And I think certain different groups, their priority is different virtues, if you will. So
Mm,
sometimes I'm curious if sort of that theme is like a real it's a real pleasure button for people on the left. It's a real like big golden light in the sky kind of. And so that's just one thing to begin with, sort of naming that some of those qualities I think are things that are more, amped up and celebrated on the left, which doesn't mean that folks on the right don't love peace just as much, but I think the way we talk about it and the way we approach it, I think is probably very different. So that's just one thought to start with, but not even I think the most important one, but one thing just to put out there that I think is a major piece of it is that, and my experience with Braver Angels, and that was really during the Biden years. During that time, my experience is that Reds felt very attacked and condemned and spit upon and shamed and like all kinds of very negative things. And so, and I think they rightly felt that if they went into an environment dominated by blues, that they would experience being spit upon essentially, emotionally, verbally, and that they, didn't really want to do that. There's a sense that anything that even has a whiff of this might be like a blue environment is an immediate like get me out of here for a lot of people, I think. So just naming that as a piece of this. Another thing that I came to sort of have more awareness of over time is that I think as a blue, the natural assumption that I made when I first became active in depolarization work is that what works for me works for you in terms of what works on the left works on the right. So like I want to have a conversation against across difference and like learn more about you. And that's going to help me have empathy for you. And that sounds like a great idea to me. Let's do it. What time? Tomorrow? You know what I mean? Whereas it's not necessarily the same thing for folks on the right. And I think one of the major reasons is that my perspective is from the Biden years, but is that the culture in America, at least Reds will tell you, and I agree with them, that the culture in America is very heavily blue dominated. The television, movies, Hollywood is very left leaning. A lot of things have changed in our culture for the better, in my opinion, but a lot of things have changed. Well, some things for the worse, but many for the better because of mass media, and that a lot of that is blue leaning.
Mm.
Plus, and there plus major educational institutions are predominantly left leaning. So there's sort of a feeling that I came to discover for folks on the right, in my impression, that they are sort of being drowned in like blue culture that they don't like or approve of, and they're having to sort of like push it away in order to preserve what they think is the right way to live. Whereas for blues, I think it's like those Reds are like somewhere out there in like the hinterlands and don't know anything about what they think. And so I think there's a curiosity that for blues, a friend of mine used the word that Reds are exotic for blues. There's this, who are they? What do they think? Why do they think that way? Whereas and then the assumption is, well, like they must feel the same way about me because I don't know about them. So they must not, they must feel the same way about me when actually they feel like they've been drowning in like 1,000 blues. So I think that's a factor in terms of the kind of the curiosity piece. As well as, again, I do think I wonder about if there's some things culturally that just predispose blues to wanting to get to know other cultures and, kind of learn about different viewpoints and like that these are all sort of somehow baked into the values that liberals elevate.
Mm.
Still kind of chewing on it, but I'm curious about that, and I'm curious if maybe for Reds, I'm curious if the goal is to sort of preserve your culture, which is being kind of battered by this culture you disagree with. If the idea of like let's get to know people who think differently from me is kind of like I'm not so sure about that. So that's a piece of it, I think. I think also, another thing that I've learned is that a lot of the language in the bridging organizations is very blue. And a lot of it is written by Blues, and the activities are designed by Blues. And again, these assumptions that the folks on the other side think the same way or use the same vocabulary, or this word means the same thing to me as it means to them, it's not always true. So, for example, folks on the right think that the idea of bridging means that everyone has to be nice to each other, which means I can't have my own voice, which means I have to be silenced and canceled. And so that's very unappealing, you know. Uh, but so even the word bridging, you know, is coded blue. And I think over the years, a lot of different words that one would think are neutral have come to be coded to one side or the other. And once you really spend time with both sides, it starts to become more glaring that like, oh, that word, I immediately know what side you're on. You know, even the word like democracy has become coded to the left, right? Or what was another one?
There is the Braver Angels language guide, which has I think a lot of
Yeah.
them. But yeah, the language has become highly coded now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that, you know, people immediately push away from if they notice a thing like that. And I think also to some extent, I wonder about if the bridging activities themselves are even blue coded, and the idea that certain activities are activities that blues like to do more than red. So
Like workshops.
workshops or just talking to somebody on the other side, it kind of begs the question of who designed the activities? Were they designed by blues or by reds? And what kind of reds? And I mean, it's one complaint we heard a lot when I was at Braver Angels from the Reds was that there was no like action. Like, what are we doing? We're just talking. How's that helping? And so, a friend suggested, what if we did a service project and people there were just, from mixed background. It's like, what does bridging look like that is appealing to the right? Um, and does it look like blues going into their environment, into the red environment, rather than asking reds to come into the blue environment?
Mhm.
If you're really looking at what does it look like to connect and across difference, I think, sometimes it's necessary to start getting creative about what actually puts one in contact with people who are different, rather
Right.
than trying to pull them into an activity that isn't really what they're kind of into. So that's a lot of ideas. I mean, I have a few more if you want me to keep going, or one or two more.
Yeah,
One.
why not?
Okay. Well, another one that I asked a friend who's read is that, the belief is that blues are going to try to change your mind. Don't go there. They're going to try to change your mind. And ironically, I have come to, the truth is that that is often very much true, even for folks who don't think that that's what they want. And I have this quote here from a read at Braver Angels. For most blues, bridging is just a strategy to get their way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Powerful statement. And this is a read who's very active with Braver Angels, but I think it speaks to why some other reds who are not invested to begin with can be, you know, hesitant to come into the orbit.
So you've just alluded to, I think, some inadvertent, unintentional, unconscious ways that blues end up creating more polarization, like despite the best of intentions. But what do you think are some ways that blues fan the flames of polarization and vice versa? What do you think reds do to wildly fan those flames as well?
Well, I think to me on the left, the most obvious fanning the flames is the contempt and derision, flyover states, and mocking, lack of education is why they voted for Trump. And there's very well-meaning condescension about like, it's not their fault if they just don't have access to education, and that's why they're doing it, which is not, that is missing a lot of the point. There is just so much that is said, and sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's unintentional. But the presumption that people are either stupid or evil or crazy, essentially, is very distancing. One thing when I was running a workshop I ran once, that I used to say to conservatives as I was trying to recruit them to come, was that I would tell them, this was for the Red Blue workshop, I would try to be as empathetic as I could. And so I would try to speak in a way that people could feel me as a safe person, because that was my intention, to be that in that space. I would acknowledge that blues have been unkind and derisive, and I told them that this is a place where we're gonna have a moderator, and we're gonna make sure you have equal space and time to speak, because their impression of blues is that blues take up all the space with their talking and yelling, and that blues are incredibly mean and attacking to them, and it's very unpleasant to be around. So uh, whether blues mean it that way or agree that that's how it was, again, this is during the Biden years. My experience is that's how most Reds experienced it.
And so, what are some of the things that Reds do to contribute to polarization?
One thing that I observed when I was going into uh, Red environments that this question makes me think of is, on one occasion, I mean, I know it happens on many occasions, I was at an event where they had a speaker who was a pastor, and he had a whole PowerPoint. I found this man to be incredibly polarizing and manipulative, in my opinion. He had a whole PowerPoint that he went through, and he was really like whipping up the crowd, their anger and their, and he was really whipping them up that the left is evil. And one example of something that he gave to demonstrate that, and really not just, when I say evil, I mean like aligned with the devil,
Mm.
saying that to a group of faithful Christians for whom that they who would take that very seriously, right? So one example that was on this PowerPoint was that apparently I learned this from his PowerPoint, that Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis or her graduate thesis, some kind of thesis, on Saul Alinsky, who was an organizer earlier in the 20th century. And Saul Alinsky, who, as best I can tell, was not a religious person, made a couple of comments, whether you might think they're flippant or not, but he made a couple of comments about the devil. And, like if somebody asked him like, well, do you like, what do you think happens when you die? And he said, well, I don't know, but like if there's a heaven and hell, then I'd rather go to hell. And they said, well, why? And he said, well, because that's where the people, like that's where the outcasts are, and I would organize them, because that's what I do, is I organize the outcasts, you know what I mean? So, but whatever, and I may not have encapsulated that exactly the way it was, but you get the idea. Comments like that, which I will say, coming from, for groups on the left who are not particularly religious, there are sometimes flippant comments made about religious figures such as the devil or anybody, that are not necessarily intended in a serious way. And of course, I don't know Saul Alinsky. I don't know how he meant it. But anyways, coming back to my point with this PowerPoint, so this speaker essentially said, look, he hammered it in. Hillary Clinton did her thesis on this person who aligned himself with the devil. Like, and basically was like, Hillary Clinton has like a direct line to the devil. And, and I mean, he's freaking people out, because people are like, oh my God, I didn't know this. Like, that's crazy. Like so he puts up a quote from Saul Alinsky where, there's some kind of
Right.
reference to the devil. I mean, literally, I think he made two references in all of his, many writings, but the point is, he said Hillary Clinton chose, out of all the things she could do her thesis on, she chose to focus on a man who is all about being together with the devil, and like this is who the left is, so this is completely freaking out the audience, completely freaking
Wow.
them out, and giving them information that they did not have before. And it's, of course, it's one piece of a larger picture, but he's only showing that one piece, which is, of course, what happens in polarization a lot of the time. So that
Hmm.
was something that I saw that I was really, it made me angry and sad, because I really felt that that was a destructive thing to be doing with what that speaker was doing.
Yeah, distortion of reality, context.
Context.
the selection of certain pieces
Yeah.
and how they are highlighted to present a point.
Yeah, and picking out one bad thing out of 1,000 things and focusing on that one thing and
Right.
terrifying everybody that that one thing is going to come on your doorstep tomorrow.
The story about how you went and you saw that presentation by a vat pastor is a great example of how you tend to go put yourself in these situations and circumstances that are not, that are like not fun. They're highly polarized, right? And you'll do this, you'll go to say the other side's polarized setting. So when you do that, when you go venture into these polarized places, how do you stay grounded? How do you stay centered? When people are saying and doing things that you don't agree with or that are disturbing to you. And I ask this because a lot of people say they don't want to put themselves in this kind of setting because they feel threatened. So how do you keep yourself grounded and not getting overly threatened or upset?
It's so it's not an easy thing to do. It certainly helps to have a support system when you do it. I can tell you how I've tried to approach it, and the way I approach it isn't it's going to be different for every person what's best for them or if it's a good idea for them. The first right-leaning event that I went to was a Republican Party fundraiser, and other than those I had met through Braver Angels, I didn't really have much in the way of like red friends, or I'm from a blue bubble. I'd never been to like a red event. And I was particularly trying to meet sort of what people refer to as like the MAGA kind of Republican, um, because those are particularly underrepresented in the bridging space, those folks. And so anyway, so I went to this event. I remember, the parking lot was full of cars, and I parked my car, and I kind of like took some deep breaths. I felt like I was going into enemy territory. I felt scared. I went early on. I met another woman there somehow I found the only other blue in the room. I don't know how, but but so she and I hung out and talked to each other, but it was completely like being in a different environment. I mean, the thing that I remember most was they had, I think it was an AK-47 up for raffle. Now, I come from a world where like we don't have guns, like, you know what I mean? Like guns are bad, like, so this is extremely exotic, if you will, like surreal, you know. But so how I prepared myself, I mean, I was really nervous. I think it's gonna feel scary. It's okay if it feels scary. And just because it feels scary does not mean that it's dangerous, but it can feel scary. And it is good to go with a buddy. So I had a motive, I had a purpose, and my motive was that I was running a red blue workshop and I wanted reds to come. And so my philosophy was I want someone to come to my events. I want to be nice to them. Nobody's going to want to come to my event if I'm not nice. And besides, I really believe in the red blue workshop. I really believe in the power of it for folks on both the left and the right.
Will you say a few words about what the Red Blue Workshop?
Yeah, sure. So the Red Blue Workshop is a day-long workshop that Braver Angels original workshop that puts an equal amount of reds and blues around a table setting with a moderator, multiple moderators, in fact. And there's a series of exercises that have been designed by one of Braver Angels co-founders, who's a marriage and family therapist. And the workshop, in my experience, is very successful at opening people's hearts to each other, even though they come from radically different backgrounds. Even sometimes they've like known each other across town as like the enemy. You know, it takes people who can be deeply hostile or fearful towards each other and actually have them leave like laughing together and exchanging numbers and saying, we're going to get together. And that is magical. I mean, I think it's very hard to find. So I think it's a tremendous, the workshop is a tremendous thing. I recommend it to anyone to do it. So I really wanted Reds to come, and I really wanted MAGA Reds to come. So I did have a purpose when I went there. And so coming back to your original question, so how to be grounded and centered. When I would go into environments with Reds that were like all red, let's say, I would first of all I would sort of kind of try to create like a bubble around myself where I kind of held my own views and perspectives. And I would try to see all of what other folks were saying is kind of out there outside of that, and just try to be curious and listen. Listening doesn't mean that I think what they're saying is right, and not challenging them. Like that doesn't mean that I think what they're saying is right. It just means that I'm really curious how they got to that conclusion. And because there's a lot of logic in there, and I just don't know all the steps of how they got there. But to treat other people like they're reasonable human beings, and I'm the one who's lacking information, it was sort of how I would approach it. And sometimes, I mean, I did get upset. I mean, I tried not to voice it to those folks. I would wait till I left and I would talk to other folks who were in the bridging space about what I'd heard and why it upset me. And I think it's probably very difficult. I think there's very few people who wouldn't be upset probably listening to things on the opposite side. But I learned so much. And so yeah, so back to your question about how to be grounded and centered, reminding yourself before you go in, you're going to hear stuff you don't agree with, you don't believe. You might feel outraged or despair that the other person thinks what they think. Um, but it's really important, at least this is how I approached it, to not challenge other people. Like, well, why do you think that? As much as to be curious. And part of what I did, which is not always easy to do for everyone, but I tried to reassure the Reds that I met that I was sympathetic to them, that I was sympathetic to their perspective, that I believed that it made sense, that they did see themselves during the Biden years as victims of blues. And I think a lot of blues are not aware of that, or would be disturbed to think that, but they did see, I think a lot of Reds saw themselves that way. And so
So were you genuinely sympathetic?
yeah, I mean, what I was genuinely sympathetic to is the fact that I do think have been disparaging, have been incredibly toxic towards Reds. And
Okay.
I don't think that's appropriate. And I think it completely I think it is one of the ways, as we discussed before, that liberals contribute to polarization. And so I did feel genuine sympathy, empathy um, for the Red experience of being treated poorly by blues.
So I'm hearing a few different things here. One is you said earlier that it's scary. It's okay that it's scary. And even though it feels scary, it does not mean that it is actually dangerous. And you were able to make that distinction that it's scary, there's fear, my heart's racing.
Mhm.
But you know what? This is not actually a dangerous situation. Okay, so that diffuses some of that fear, right? You can move through that and walk into the room. And I'm
People.
also hearing you say you have this bubble, right? And it's a protection. You're in
Mhm.
your protective bubble, which is Rachel, Rachel's identity, Rachel's personhood, Rachel as a human being is in a safe bubble. And this bubble is floating and exploring in the room with new people, meeting new people. But that thinking about it as a bubble means that you are protected, right? Who you are is protected.
Yeah.
And so there's that layer, right,
Mhm.
that keeps you distant yet interactive. And then you talk about how you would go and you already knew that there was this issue of Reds feeling the contempt, feeling dismissed, feeling like victims, feeling like they've been drowning in a dominating blue culture. So this gave you genuine sympathy, which helps you be curious. And also, I think that's a key to the grounding, it sounds like. You have this sympathy. That's a very powerful emotion, sympathy and empathy. so that
No.
you can be angry at something that you hear, but you know to hold that in. You don't confront them, you don't challenge them, but you save that for later when you go back to
Yeah.
supportive space. Yeah.
I think another emotion that I something I didn't mention that I think is very important to me. And one other thing about the bubble is that I think within the bubble, it's where what I know to be true is. Because my experience when you go to these environments, it can be very topsy-turvy feeling because literally the things that are the topics being discussed are completely different from the topics on the left. The understanding of what has happened in the past is completely different from what the understanding is on the left. And then of course, what your understanding of what has happened in the past informs how you feel about things happening in the present. And so it's like it's a lot. And so I think again, to have in that bubble, like what I believe, what I know to be true, what the evidence I've seen says is true, or my friends have told me is true, stays in here. And out there, I'm curious and I'm questioning. And sometimes things do come up where I have to go back and say, like, oh my God, is this true? I mean, it's really tricky. I mean, the world we live in is very tricky.
Mm.
But another piece that I think for me is really important, and this isn't what everybody's focus is on at Braver Angels. I think different people are attracted to depolarization for different reasons, and that's great. For me, there's something from the nonviolent philosophy, I think, that has to do with unconditional love for others. And unconditional love, it doesn't mean that the person is good or right or your friend. It has something to do with their humanity. And
Mm.
I think for me, something that that the depolarization work has given me is the idea that it's possible to walk into an environment with people who I'm supposed to hate and fear, and that I can practice or do my best to practice love towards them and also be a blue. I can out myself as a blue, be a blue who is behaving in a loving and kind manner, which is completely unfamiliar to Reds, to many Reds. So something about the quest to live that kind of love and to practice it as like a verb is maybe like aspirational, for me, or is something that I have found powerful, or there's this deeper layer to this work, can be, so I think for me also to go into an environment like that and to try to listen to somebody, I didn't I did get upset by that speaker at that event, and I don't know if I'd had a little more time. uh I'm, I considered the idea of reaching out to him and asking him to have lunch, and asking to get to know them and, you know, learning more. I mean, I feel like over time, I think I've gotten a better barometer of when it's okay for me to challenge somebody on something that they said, and how to do that in a way that's not disrespectful, that's more curious, or having a hard time, I'm having a hard time aligning with this, but maybe I'm not understanding fully, or this is how I see it. But I know that for a lot of the folks that I met on the right, I didn't try to do that right away. That can be very off-putting. It can feel like that challenge and that thing about how they're trying to change you, which often we are. Often we're like, why do they think that? That's dumb. That's wrong. They have the wrong information. Blah blah blah. Those are all forms of they're wrong, I'm right. I care about my country, so I have to like save this person from their wrong beliefs. That love thing is one piece I thought might be helpful to share. And then
Yeah. So that has really changed you.
I
This-
think for me that's been such a gift of being in, yeah, it has been a tremendous gift.
I mean, to cultivate that ability to summon unconditional love for the people that you are supposed to not like or even hate because of what they believe, what they do, what they say, how they present as a human, yet you've been working on that unconditional love. And that is really deep. That is really profound.
I think the purpose, and I'm just making this up on the spot, I haven't deeply theorized about this, but there's both the way in which that other person feeling that, for them to actually feel that this person who's from this hated opposite side, this enemy side, is actually being kind and loving to them, like
Mm.
literally like, I'm going to bake cookies and bring them to you, like that kind of, with expecting nothing in return, and not trying to change anything about you or tell you that you're a bad person. There's something about that other person getting to have the experience of being loved. And then
Mhm.
there's also, for me, which I suppose I can't control. They might feel it, they might not. And then I suppose primarily for me, it's a gift for me to get to do that. Like it makes me a better person to do that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think it's like a little bit of light in the darkness.
Mm. Light in the darkness. So this is a good segue to my last question for you, which is, in our polarized world, what can ordinary people like you and me do to reduce toxic polarization? I mean, you've gone very deep with this. Um, you've I think reached levels and continue to reach levels that a lot of us can't certainly start out with. But if you're new to the whole polarization issue and trying to depolarize, just what can ordinary people do to start?
Well, I mean, I think definitely meeting people who think differently from you is a great idea. Of course, how you meet them, it can make the difference between if it's a good or bad interaction. And I think Braver Angels provides a lot of tools. So I think learning the Braver Angels tools, practicing them, those are all really great ways to do that. And so I think that idea of going outside your bubble, and one thing that I think is also important is just being aware that, just of how polarizing the media is. On both sides, the media can be very, very polarized. And so there's a number of news sources that I no longer regard as being neutral. So CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, those are all left-leaning newspapers. And I don't mean that in a bad way or a good way or anything, just as a matter of fact, kind of a way that, the idea that sort of the news is on the news page and the opinions on the opinion page. I think most newspapers have blended them all, the opinion, into the news page. And
Right.
so depending on whether the opinion is left-leaning or right-leaning. So one thing, so there are some different sites that try to help people become more cognizant of those biases that are, you're not always aware of when you're reading things. I definitely know folks on the left who are like, no, the New York Times is completely neutral. And I'm like, but it's not. And it can be hard to see it, it can just be hard to see it. So, one app that a friend recommends is called Ground News, and it helps you
Yeah.
see how different issues are being presented in different places.
Mhm.
Frankly, certain issues are just not even presented at all on one side. They might be front page on the left and not shown at all on the right, and vice
Right.
versa, which is like
Mm.
again, it's part of how we got here. So I'd say looking to kind of debunk your own environment a little bit and have more awareness of it is a good thing.
Just a related question. Would you say that you started to see the bias in, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post as a result of you venturing out into red spaces or getting out of your comfort zone? How did you start to see it?
I think for me, the New York Times coverage of the 2016 election was really um, inaccurate, as it turned out. I think that was a real shock for many people. Um, but yes, I do think since getting more involved with Braver Angels, since listening to more folks on the right, I've started to see more how the headlines and the stories in so many newspapers are really filled with various biases and assumptions. So I do think, yes, the more that I spent time with people who have those different views, just listening, just really listening to learn, uh, the more I could see how the headlines were denigrating the opposite side, or painting a particular series of events in a way that the other side completely sees it 100% differently. And I still feel just a lot of humbleness that there's so much I don't see. And I think that's one of the hardest things being a blue. For me, was realizing over time, realizing how much I had been contributing to the problem and really just honestly not realizing it. I'm sure we're both sides are equally, responsible, but I do think we have a lot of work to do here on our own side. So I don't mean that to be overly critical of blues. Also, I think we are a wonderful group of people who care tremendously, have huge hearts, and really want to do good in the world. But I think we are all in a moment where very challenging.
We're going to wrap up. This has been fabulous. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for your time and your insights and your heart, sharing your heart with us. And thanks again to everyone listening. If you would like more information about Braver Angels, please go to our website, braverangels.org. And to find out about local events here in Oregon, please go to braverangels.org/Oregon.
You know I love you. Sing it if you know it. Oh, yeah, I love you. Oh, hi-yo, namaste. You know I love you.
Music for this episode is Hello, I Love You, written by Ben Karen and Leo Gallo, and performed by Ben Karen, Fadine Keelty, Ray Cole, Nathan Heldman, Oscar Bugarin, and Mary Keating. Watch this and other songs by Ben Karen on youtube.com/Ben Karen Creates. Thanks to Ben and team for allowing us to use this song.